Welcome into Warchant TV. This is Ira Schoffel, managing editor of Warchant.com. And if you see the guy next to me, you know what we're going to talk about. We're not just the Noles. Peter Schoenthal, the CEO of Athliance, one of the leaders in the NIL space, is here. And when he's here, we're going to talk about the NIL and the business side of sports. And so glad to have you here. How are you doing, Peter? It's been a few weeks since we've had you on.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been hectic. I'm losing even more hair. This space is chaotic and crazy. A lot of things happening that are shaping the future of college sports as we know it. So excited to come on here and talk about it.
Awesome, man. Well, we actually texted a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, when some athletic department officials, coaches, players, including some from Florida State, went up to Capitol Hill and talked to Congress about the NIL and the NIL space and the future of college athletics with the NIL. And the reactions on Twitter were pretty funny because I think, I can just speak for myself and for people that didn't see this. You realize that people in Congress aren't necessarily very well versed in what's happening in college athletics and certainly in the NIL space. And so that was pretty transparent. And that concerned me to the point where I'm like, do we really want these people involved? But I also know that we probably do need them involved. So I want to get your kind of takeaways on the appearance before that congressional hearing.
Yeah, well, first off, it was awesome to see a Seminole up there and dominate.
She was awesome.
By far the best panelist, by far the most insightful. I have a different take with the congressional hearing because I've been a big proponent that we do need federal intervention, but I probably have a different reason why, and we'll touch a little bit on that. What I didn't like about it necessarily was the panel, right? We're talking about name, image, and likeness. And name, image, and likeness really impacts, for the most part, Division I and Power 5 sports, particularly when we talk about football and basketball, although it also impacts Title IX athletes and female athletes. And so we have a panel of 5 people where you have Pat Chun, who is the athletic director at Washington State Power 5 school. Great. Trey Burton, SEC football player at UF. That works. Kelsey Mudge at Florida State. Awesome. But then we have the Patriot League commissioner and a Division II president who had no idea what was going on. But everyone is complaining about the congressional hearing because, one, it ended up becoming an employment versus amateurism discussion, right, which I don't have a problem with because you really can't talk about NIL rules and federal legislation without talking about employment versus amateurism under antitrust laws. They do go hand in hand when talking about federal intervention. So I didn't have a problem with that. But I thought the best point and the best part of that was actually what you referenced, which was these congressional men and women who have no idea what's going on in college sports.
Right.
But they have no idea what's going on from the larger picture as it pertains to what NIL really is and the business of NIL and the future of college sports. Now, you and I work in this space, so we find these questions to be ridiculous. But I didn't find them to be ridiculous because those are the same questions I get from my friends and my family about college sports and NIL. All right. So it was important for those members who are going to be making potential decisions for the future of what we love to show that they have no idea what's going on and therefore to be educated. The takeaway that I saw was that, wait a minute, we love college sports. We want to protect this. And yes, the revenue generating athletes like football and basketball deserve a piece of the pie. But if we end up going towards an employment model, this is really going to negatively impact women's sports. It's going to impact Olympic sports. It's going to impact Division II and Division III sports. And you know what? A lot of these athletes don't want to be employees. Our softball athletes said it. I work with Division II and Division III athletes. They don't want to be employees. So being able to educate them on that and really see that they have no idea what they're talking about is very important if we're going to get them involved in the future of what we love. Because at the end of the day, I'm one of the proponents that believes there is a have your cake and eat it too. We can get to a place where athletes who generate revenue, like Florida State football players, get a piece of that pie, specifically on the TV deals. Well, we don't have to make them employees so we can keep Title IX and Olympic sports going. Because if we get rid of Title IX and Olympic sports, if we make them employees, that could go away, and I can explain why.
Yeah, and I apologize for the beginning. I mentioned that Florida State had a representative there. I didn't say it's Kaley Mudge from the FSU softball team, who was outstanding. And she also wrote a I think, a letter to the editor, an op-ed piece to the St. Pete Times, I believe, following up on her points. And one of the things she talked about, and I think that's why things got a little conflated, not because of her, but just because of the whole topic. But she was arguing about the California bill, which I think that was one of her main things, was the fact that would take 50% of, I think the way it reads is 50% of all the revenue from sports that make a profit, which basically is football and men's basketball, would then be redistributed to the players in those sports in a trust fund. And then but then the next step, and and again, a lot of people would say is, well, how would you fund these other sports? Football is what funds 99% of the other sports. Men's basketball makes a profit as well at some schools. Baseball sometimes breaks even, but that's about it. And so if you took all that money and put it into, gave it to the players, then, you wouldn't be able to fund these other sports. I mean, I think that's not an NIL issue necessarily.
No, it's not. But again, you can't have the conversation in front of Congress without talking about where this is going, which is, if we're going to regulate NIL, we have to have the talk about what is the status of athletes under this legislation.
Right?
Are they employees or not? Now I'm going to push back a little bit on Ms. Mudge. I think there is a play in that California bill. What is important is athletes will not be employees. That's great.
Right.
Because if we make them employees, that's even worse. Because say goodbye to Title IX.
And that's a separate piece of legislation in another state.
Correct.
Where they're proposing that to make them athletes.
But if you look at the California one, it's very easy to make up that money for other sports. If you bake in the revenue into these new TV deals, which are happening all the time, right? And then athletic departments have to, probably start spending a little bit differently. Like, maybe you don't put all that money into all these facilities, and maybe Clemson doesn't have a slide. Like, who needs a slide? You know what I mean?
Right.
There are ways to do it. So I don't mind the California bill as much. My bigger fear is if we go to an employment model, all right, we're going to have professionalism for football and basketball, and we could lose all of the other sports. Because under that model, we're going to lose Title IX, right? And the argument for people that want employment drives me nuts, right? These athletes deserve a piece of the pie if they generate revenue. I agree. Yes, they do. But the reason that these proponents of employment say that we need employment is that we need to protect the athletes, because these schools are money hungry. The NCAA is money hungry. And, they're going to do everything to keep the cash away from the athletes. All right, that's fine. I get it. So we need to share revenue, and we need that baked into the law. But under that same model, those proponents for employment are saying, well, those schools that are money hungry are not going to cut sports that lose money because it's good for the university. No. You don't get both ways. If you're telling me that these schools in the NCAA only care about money, and they have an opportunity to cut non-revenue generating sports, under that guise, they're going to. So if we can stop the employment movement and keep Title IX in place, we're going to be able to keep, softball. We're going to be able to keep swimming. We're going to be able to keep Division II and Division III sports while we take care of the revenue generating athletes like football and basketball. And by the way, once we decide on that, we can have uniform rules that protect the sport, because that's actually why we need federal legislation, which is why you saw my tweet. The reason we need federal legislation is because the states are getting a little dirty. All right. And we need to stop them from getting dirty. And I can explain that as well.
Yeah, we're going to go there next. I wanted to touch back, though, real quick on the California thing, though, because I do think that there's a feeling, at least from administrators of Florida State, and they spoke about this publicly at the last Board of Trustees meeting, is that, that California bill would be in conflict with Title IX, because it would make it so difficult for them to even fund those other sports. And again, I mean, this is probably a larger debate. I just did want to put that out there, that they feel like it would endanger the ability to fund those other sports, particularly the women's sports.
It would under Title IX, but what I believe is if we go that route, there'll be a change to Title IX, but also there's going to have to be almost like a working agreement with all the universities as to, we're just going to have to redistribute funds, right? Like, we might not be able to build all these immaculate buildings and these big locker room renovations for football and things of that, because we're going to need to stay Title IX compliant. But let's be honest, there isn't a single Power 5 or Division I school that is Title IX compliant right now. Right. So there is a way to do it. It will make funding it more difficult. It will. But we're just going down a path where it's very difficult if you work in college athletics right now, because you're dealing with different levels. But the bigger issue is not all athletes are the same, right? We have to find this common ground where we find a way to fund other sports like Title IX sports, which are, female sports, and Olympic sports, while also doing what's right by the athletes. Let's be honest. Football players and Division I and Power 5 basketball players are the reason why all this revenue is coming in, and they're not getting a piece of it. And there is a model out there where we can give them a piece of that pie, and there's still enough money to go around for the other sports. Will it be a challenge? Absolutely. But based on today's legal landscape, there is no avoiding revenue sharing for revenue generating athletes. So although that California bill might be a little too far, we all have to start wrapping our heads around the fact that that is inevitable. So let's start working on a model now, because that's the best way to solve this space and protect it, which is getting ahead of it rather than being reactionary, which has been the NCAA's issue for 100 years.
Right. And I agree with you. You talked about the buildings. The buildings are, I guess some people can point to the buildings as a sign of the excess. But the biggest problem to me is the coaches' salaries. I mean, you have these athletes. I mean, you've got coaches making over $10 million a year, and you've got these athletes who are not. And so that's, I think that's a frustration as well.
Yeah. And what's tough about that, though, is coaches stay longer than athletes. So you could argue that they do have more value. That doesn't mean the athletes shouldn't get anything.
But just from an optics standpoint, you have Jimbo Fisher making, has a contract where he can make $700 million or whatever it is, and the athletes are still, going by.
Well, I was going to touch on the optics, right? Because this is where things get so confusing, right? The coaches' salaries, for the most part, aren't funded by the university. Right. That's money raised by the boosters. That's held in trust by the universities. I'm very close with a few schools, and one Power 5 school said it best. Where we messed this whole system up was by allowing the money that boosters raise for coaches to funnel through universities. We should have capped all of them at $250,000 and allowed them to negotiate on their own with boosters. Because then you couldn't say this school pays $10 million to Jimbo, right? It's really the boosters raising a large portion of the money and giving it to the school to make that payment. So again, I think there's a model that if we all work together, where we can pay revenue generating athletes, and there's enough money to fund all the other sports and get spending under control, and we all live happily ever after. But it's going to involve change. And listen, coaches at some point might feel that. Don't tell Jimmy Sexton, but they might.
Moving on. So you mentioned the state laws. So you were active on Twitter this week, and people again can follow you on Twitter at Pete NIL, correct?
Yeah, NIL Pete.
NIL Pete. I'm sorry. I don't know who Pete NIL is, but he just got some followers at NIL Pete. Why don't you tell people about what some of the things that are percolating now on the state levels in absence of federal legislation?
All right. Weirdly enough, we don't need federal legislation if not for the states. All right. So let's go down a journey of how we got here. All right. About a year and a half before NIL started, Florida moved the needle, right? We announced that we were starting NIL July 1st, 2021 through a state bill. All right. Previously, the only other state that had a bill was California, and this wasn't going to start until 2023. And I speak with Chip LaMarca, who wrote the bill. He's a state representative here in South Florida. And the reason for that bill was their fear was that the NCAA was going to go back on its word and not allow student athletes to profit off their name, image, and likeness. Great idea. Great job, Chip LaMarca. Great job, state of Florida. You protected athletes' rights. But then over the course of the next year, the NCAA takes a beating in front of the Supreme Court in the Alston case. Now, the Alston case had very little to do with NIL. It had everything to do with antitrust issues involving student athletes and the NCAA. And what that case stood for regarding NIL was that the NCAA could not go back on its word. Otherwise, they were going to get crushed by the courts. So they were moving forward. But what happened was all of these other states wanted to get involved in NIL, and we had 28 bills come into place. All right. Now, when those bills came into place, they were fine, but there were some conflicts. And I must remind you that we don't have a single Division I conference where every member in that conference comes from a single state, which makes this a federal issue. Okay, great. Throughout that first year of NIL, I can't believe I'm standing up for them on this. The NCAA gets their you-know-what together. We actually have at the NCAA level the rules that we need, right? Quid pro quo, which means you got to do something for the money. I can't just hand you $100,000. The deal can't be an inducement. We could talk about whether that's happening or not, but the rules on the books, right? And it can't be pay for play. I can't just give you $100 to score a touchdown, right? Great. Then we got guidance on the role of the boosters and the collectives, what the university could and couldn't do, and the difference between a recruit and transfer portal player and an enroll player. That's all we need. As it pertains to what people and schools are going to do with their logos and vice categories like beer, that's up to the schools. That's fine. So we don't need federal legislation except for the states. When you have all these different state bills, it makes it very confusing and it limits what the NCAA can do. Well, it's gotten even worse now because you have states like Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas, which are literally trying to create advantages for their in-state universities by building in what we call safe harbor rules, which would make it illegal for the NCAA to go after them. And if they do, they can be sued in state court. Now, I think the NCAA would win that because that would eventually make its way to federal court. But that's a mess. The only way to make this space uniform, so every school is working with the same rules now, is if the federal government gets involved, which would supersede those state bills. We don't need a federal bill if all the states get out of the way and say, you know what, we're going to repeal all of our NIL bills. Now, if every state got rid of their bills, we're in a good space.
But that's not happening.
Well, they're not going to do that for a few reasons. One, a lot of these state legislatures put their names on it and they want the credit for it and they run on that, right? The other thing is they're fans and they want to create advantages. And once again, the adults in the room screwed this up, and that's the states. And the reason I get so angry about this is those bills are facades. There isn't one state that has launched a single investigation regarding NIL in 2 years, and we know that the space is the Wild West. Right. There isn't a single state that's gone after improper agent work, right? The agents are ruining this space. And there hasn't been one state that's launched an investigation. So these state bills mean nothing. And now they're getting in the way of listen, a free market doesn't mean zero rules. A capitalistic society doesn't mean zero rules. It means reasonable rules and less regulation. Right now, we just have zero regulation and people think there's no rules. And that's why we're getting this crazy space.
I'll recap one more thing with Congress and then we'll move on to a couple other topics. But so you make a good point. So, watching that hearing, I was getting frustrated at their lack of knowledge. But I guess the reality is it's how it's supposed to work, right? I mean, like they have a hearing to hear about the issue. It's not like they're all knowing. They don't know everything about every issue. And then as they get more information, their staff gets more information, then they can move forward. So I guess, do you think that that's going to happen? Do you feel like that set the table for where maybe there actually is going to be work done and they may revisit it
yes.
at the congressional level?
Yes, and my hope is that we get something moving with NIL first, at least until before August, before the election cycle kicks up, because then it's going to be very difficult. As it pertains to amateurism and employment, we have some time. There is a case in the court system called Johnson versus NCAA that has to do with amateurism versus employment. But we're a few years away, I think 2 years probably, from that figuring itself out. So there's time for the federal government to get involved and create a law for college athletes or give an antitrust exemption, and as long as the NCAA is willing to share revenue with athletes. That's going to happen regardless. But in the meantime, it would be very nice to get literally just a federal bill that says the NCAA, their rules regarding NIL, they're allowed to enforce them. That's really all they have to say. And then we can have a safe space. I meet with the NCAA. I get why they're the big bad wolf. They're not looking to really punish this space. They just want to go after the people that are offering deals to recruits to get them to go to schools and are doing the very big illegal deals. Most of this space is pretty safe. It's really in the poaching of athletes and the offering of deals to athletes who are either high school recruits or in the transfer portal. We get on top of that, we could have a safe space.
Awesome. All right, last two topics. First one is kind of perfect dovetail. You set me up perfectly, man. You put it on a tee. The transfer portal opened back up this week. And so now for 2 weeks, college football players are going back in the portal, and there's going to be some shuffling. Florida State, who we cover, has already had a few players enter the portal. You talked about poaching. I mean, that clearly is happening I mean, we know it's happening. How much it's happening is up for debate, but we know it's happening. And we hear anecdotally stories of players at certain schools already hearing, hey, if you went to this school, this might be available, all that. I was curious, though, as we're kind of like into, I don't know, NIL 2.0 or 3.0 now. If players already have deals, if they already have NIL deals in place, like at their current college with their marketing firms in their area, if they leave and want to go to another school and try to find NIL opportunities there, what happens to those deals at the prior school? Can you talk about any of the mechanics of that and whether or not, and how big of a problem do you think poaching is?
Well, poaching is a problem. And I will say to all athletes out there, buyer beware, because these athletes aren't signing contracts before they get to the school, right? So we've heard numerous stories of athletes who were made promises, make a transfer, and they did not receive what they were told, and now they're stuck. Or the payments were late. It's a nightmare. Again, when we speak with athletes, and I'm going to the On3 National Showcase to meet with the top 50 athletes in the country that are recruits, the message really is, what's the goal in life? If the goal is the NFL, like, you'll get paid wherever you go, right? Make sure you make the right decision. That's the big thing. Now, going to the contracts, right? You have a player at school A who has an NIL deal, and then they want to transfer. What happens with that contract?
And the reason I ask is because, for example, Battle's End at Florida State signed a bunch of players at the end of last season, made a big deal in December. All these, and I think there was a perception that, okay, these guys are all locked down now. Like they've signed their deals to Florida State, but those guys can leave, right? I mean,
yes. So it's all dependent on the breakdown of the contract, if you will. Most collectives are getting smart and doing what we call, maybe 6-month contracts, which is like semester by semester, right? So we can reevaluate every semester. Even if there's a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, this is what you're going to get. It protects the collective and the athlete if someone wants to break that contract without having a breach of contract, right? It makes it cleaner. Some of these collectives think they're smart by tying the contract to location, right? And I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm going to give you $10,000 a month, $120,000 a year for your marketing rights. That's fine, right? That's all good and dandy. We need to make sure at the end of that contract that you at least did enough work to justify that money, which isn't that difficult. It really isn't. But most of those contracts will tie appearances. Like, you've got to do 2 or 3 monthly appearances at this location. And it's usually at the location where the university is. So let's say I'm working with Battle's End and I have to do an appearance at Bill's Bookstore in Tallahassee 2 times a month. If I transfer and I go to Southern California, I'm not getting back for those appearances, right? So I, as the athlete, have breached the contract, which allows everyone out of it. And you're not really seeing athletes fight that because they know they breached it, and they're basically entering into other contracts. Some of these collective deals own the athlete's marketing rights exclusively. So if they want to transfer and sign with another collective, they have to ask to get out of their current collective deal, which everyone is doing anyway. So weirdly enough, that isn't as big of an issue, now, because a lot of these collectives got burned on the front side, right? I tell athletes all the time, if you're going to transfer, hey, maybe you want to do it to a place that isn't too far away so you can get back for some of these appearances and double dip. So a lot of these collectives that because I work, I deal with, collectives and athletes on both sides. Never a conflict like a certain lawyer at a certain local university in the state of Florida. But what we tell them is, if you're a collective, start doing your appearances around game days and game weekends, right? If we have a noon game, do a signing, a memorabilia signing at night or the day after, because it's going to be very difficult if the athlete transfers to get back on game day or that Sunday. So there's gamesmanship here, but we're not hearing many athletes who are getting upset about not getting let out of their deal or the double dipping from the collective side. It's working out pretty well.
And then are you hearing stories just in the landscape of players signing an NIL deal and then getting approached by another school, like bidding wars? I mean, that's the kind of the fear everybody has. Are there a lot of stories of that?
Yes, but again, the bidding wars when it comes to athletes isn't that big of a deal, especially if athletes have smart representation. This goes back to the representation side. If you have good agents on your side, usually the bidding war, you're talking within, I don't know, maybe within $50,000 to $100,000 a year. Usually less. You're talking probably 25 to 50 at max, right? if you think about it, you're still getting paid a large sum of money. So at the end of the day, the goal is still, where can I get developed? Where can I get on the field? And how can I get to the NFL the best? The bad agents are the ones that are only focused on the money and walking their kids into pure bidding wars. And then they're going places where they're not playing and they're stuck and they're unhappy and they ruin their career. All right. So the good players that have legitimate agents, the bidding war is not that big of a deal. And it's being overblown, but it is happening. It is a problem. Where the smart agents, whether good or bad, are smart, though, is they're making up numbers and trying to create bidding wars that aren't there.
Right.
Like, I know for a fact, we've got people at school. Like, I spoke with a collective in the SEC this week, and they're like, we got told that this is the price because this is what this kid was offered at another school. And we just called a collective. They're like, we didn't offer that. No way. And so you can call bluffs, but that's where, listen, that's where it's kind of like the NFL, right? Where, all right, how do we know what's true and what's not? And we have to make a strategic decision on where we can go, while also making sure we're not getting outside of the culture of the university, right? What you don't want is to get in these bidding wars and all of a sudden you're paying one player this crazy number, and then the rest of the locker room is like, who's this guy? Like, why do we care about him? We saw that happen at Miami with their basketball program, right? Where Nigel Pack comes in and Isaiah Wong was like, why are we giving him $800,000? He wasn't on the Sweet 16 team last year. I'm going to walk. So buyer beware, right? So there's a lot of things that go into this. And at the end of the day, it always goes back to what I talked about on our first, YouTube podcast, whatever we want to call this, which is culture and alignment. It doesn't change. There's a reason why Florida State and Michigan and certain schools have done really well and been able to bounce back pretty quickly in the NIL space, because they were slow to it and they didn't have these bidding wars and they didn't have these issues within the locker room. Again, let's look back on the schools that had trouble year one: Miami, Florida, Texas A&M. They were spoken of so highly because of how great their NIL programs were going into year one. But look what happened to their team. And don't tell me that those difference in what freshmen and sophomores were making compared to juniors and seniors didn't impact those locker rooms. They clearly did. So a lot of factors go into it. But at the end of the day, the collectives in the schools that are succeeding are the ones that are carrying out the will and the wish of the football team or the basketball team's coaching culture.
Yeah, and I think really quick, I just want to touch on this real quick because you brought it up, but I think Jim Larrañaga deserves a ton of credit for managing that situation so well, getting those guys. And I think it's a good case study for coaches who maybe are concerned about how NIL is going to affect things, because that looked really like a tough situation a year ago. And then all he did was get them all on the same page to play together. They played together as well as anybody in the country. And obviously had a great season.
I will say, though, basketball is a little different, though, right? Because if your guys are good, they stay much, a year or two, which is what happened. Like in football, those guys are there for 3 years, so you're automatically getting guys that stay till junior year. So if you're taking care of your freshmen more than those juniors, it creates much more locker room lack of continuity, if you will, and that's where you have to weigh a lot more. Also, you have a lot more guys. Right? You've got 80 guys, compared to maybe 15 to 17.
Last thing. So I think it might have been one of the last times we talked. Texas A&M announced that they were bringing NIL in-house. They were actually going to have it be part of, I guess, their support organization. Now the University of Florida announced something similar this past week. Florida Victorious. They had their issues with the Rashada situation, and their collective was having all kinds of issues. Now they're more formally involved. When Texas A&M did it, I heard a lot of schools and a lot of ADs saying that this is probably not legal. It's probably not okay by the NCAA rules. But now you've seen Florida jump in. Are everybody just going to jump in the pool now? And do you see that changing, or are most schools still kind of waiting and seeing?
I think most schools are dipping their toe. Florida dipped their leg. Texas A&M jumped head first. All right. Okay. So there's a difference in the way you do it. Florida's collective is still separate from the university. The university is just a little bit more involved in helping out, right? Okay. Which is allowed. I don't have a problem with what Florida's doing right now. A&M is why I'm a little upset, because I think what A&M is doing is actually how NIL should be done, by bringing it in-house and having the booster club basically run it. But the reason A&M did it that way, if we look back, is they knew what bill was coming. They knew that Texas was building a bill, because they clearly worked with the legislature in Texas to create safe harbor. What
Right.
Texas just introduced was basically the NCAA can't come after our schools for infractions. So if Texas knows that that's happening, they don't mind breaking rules. They don't mind jumping head first. They don't mind saying, we're going to do what we want. That's bad for college sports. That's bad for any industry. You need uniformity. You need everyone playing by the same rules. So although I think maybe the NCAA needs to look at how they're treating booster clubs and advancement funds within athletic departments, because they're probably the safest organizations to run NIL. Currently, that is illegal. Right now, what is legal is what we're seeing at Florida, what we're seeing even a little bit with Florida State, and other schools where athletic departments are a little bit more active. I think you have to make the decision about how involved you want to be, because there's Title IX implications. But I think schools are starting to shoot first, ask questions later as it pertains to Title IX with NIL. But listen, there's multiple ways to skin a cat. Obviously, things are working very well for Florida State. Obviously, Florida had to do some things to change the narrative because of what they went through. But you can do things multiple ways.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, appreciate your time, Peter. How different are things going to look 6 months from now compared to where they are now, or things settle down for a little bit?
Every time I think things are settled down, we get it. I'm interested to see the next 6 months. And the fork in the road is, do we get some federal legislation that allows for uniformity and also a little bit more teeth with the governing body? Listen, everyone wants to beat up on the NCAA. I get it. I don't care who the governing body is at this point. We need any industry, whether it's Wall Street, whether it's college sports, you need regulation and you need everyone playing by the same rules. We can debate what those rules are. We can debate how many rules we need. But at the same time, this is something that we all love, and we want everyone playing by the same rules. That's true democracy. That's true capitalism. And let's get there.
You'd get my vote for NIL czar, Peter. I don't know if you're up for it. I don't know if there's going to be an election or we can vote, but the only downside is we lose you here at Warchant TV, and we appreciate you stopping by, not just for your knowledge of the space, but also because you're a Nole, buddy, and we appreciate it.
Listen, I'll do it, but if I do, I'm just going to shave my head and call it a lost cause. and I'll still come back on here, right? I still need media, so I'll be loyal to those who supported me.
Sounds good, man. Peter Schoenthal, from CEO of Athliance, and we appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again next time.
Thanks, Aaron.